Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are going to be talking neurodevelopmental disorders. And so, we're going to be talking about three different disorders today. They may seem somewhat um, disjointed, and you may think, how are these related to one another? Well, the three disorders that we'll talk about today are related in the sense that they are all diagnosed in childhood and they are all neurodevelopmental. And so these are, when we are looking at the DSM, these are disorders that we tend to see symptoms showing up very early, and it is not uncommon to have a diagnosis in childhood. And that's very different than a lot of the disorders that we talk about in this class. So some of these disorders you may see prevalent in your family, in the classroom, perhaps with yourselves. And so some of these will perhaps look very common to you because of exposure themselves, even though they may or may not actually be as common in relation to other disorders that are found within the DSM. So the first one is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Recognize that with ADHD, there are two main symptoms. We, of course, have inattention or ability to pay attention to one particular stimulus, and hyperactivity. This is the idea of constant movement and fidgety and things like that. ADHD is very common, especially found within kind of our school system. And so it is the prevalence rate for ADHD is over 10% of children between 4 and 17. So if you think about your average classroom of 30 students, it would not be uncommon for there to be three kids in there with who have been diagnosed with ADHD. And so it is certainly something that we do see. It is twice as common in boys as it is in girls. There are variations of ADHD, and so it's possible that you have, or I should say, there are variations of this disorder where maybe you simply have ADD, and so you have attention deficit disorder without the hyperactivity. And so we can see combinations of these different symptoms. As far as what's causing ADHD, there's some myths out there that we need to clear up. First of all, it's important to note that a child with ADHD is not a child who just has too much sugar in their system or the product of bad schooling or perhaps bad parenting or something like that. You perhaps have heard these things before, and there just simply isn't scientific evidence to support that. Instead, we do believe that there is a genetic influence of ADHD, and one thing that we have found is that the frontal lobes of the brain, which we know helps with things like impulse control, they tend to develop a little bit slower. Now, the good news is for someone experiencing ADHD is they usually pick up and catch up by around 12, 13 years old. In other words, although there is a delay, it's not a permanent delay. And so it's just that for one reason or another, the connections in that frontal lobe tends to take a little bit longer to develop with someone with ADHD compared to a healthy control. There does appear to be some environmental factors that can contribute to the development of ADHD. A low birth rate, for example, exposure to lead, prenatal teratogens such as nicotine or alcohol. These can all lead to a higher prevalence rate of ADHD. Moving on to autism, it's important to recognize that when the DSM transitioned from the DSM 4 to the DSM 5, we began to look at autism differently. And it is still in the DSM. There's some belief that autism was removed from the DSM and it's no longer considered a disorder. That's not true. We refer to this as autism spectrum disorder, though. And it's important to note that because with a spectrum, individuals who experience autism, they vary wildly. And so I really love this quote here by Dr. Stephen Shore. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And so, at first glance, you might kind of scratch your head and say, what is he talking about? But if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? If you know this one person with autism, it does not necessarily mean that that person will act and behave in similar ways as to this other person over here with autism. And so it is a spectrum disorder with symptoms that can vary wildly. And so, what do people who experience autism? What do they tend to have in common? Well, it's important to know kind of these common symptoms. First of all, autism is classified as a social disorder or a communication disorder. And so it is common to see delays in someone's ability to communicate with someone else, and also the development of a theory of mind. So we talked in a previous lecture when we talked about cognitive development. A theory of mind is the ability to understand other people's perspectives. And that is usually a pretty common symptom with autism spectrum disorder, is this struggle to truly understand the perspective of other people. We see this in social situations, right? And so we see this, for example, if you have a group project and maybe you have one person in the group who's experiencing or who has autism, and you have another person in the group who's trying to communicate with them about, hey, this would be a good idea for you to do, or this is a good role for you in the group. The person who has autism may not understand their perspective. They may not understand why they are saying the things that they are. They may misinterpret particular emotions from the person. Um, uh, Understanding facial features and emotions can be difficult. And so sometimes, if you have the look of confusion, this can be confused for the look of anger. And so that's another common thing that we sometimes see with people with autism. Uh, Repetitive, routine behaviors are very common, and so liking to do the same thing and having that particular routine. Um, b- Counting numbers, right? Having a particular hobby that they are fully invested in, and so learning the every single name of every airplane that flew during World War II, right? Obsessions with birth dates, and so I've got a good friend whose son has autism, and he knows everyone's birth date on the planet, right? And every time he sees you, he wants to talk about your birthday and these numbers, and so this kind of repetitive behavior. We also see some issues with sensory sensitivity. And so, not only loud noises, but bright lights sometimes impact people with autism more than an average person, as they are more sensitive to lights and sound and feeling textile things along those lines. As far as prevalence and causes of autism, autism is fairly common, and so we see around 1 to 2% of children diagnosed with autism by the time they're 17, and far more common in males than it is with females. When we start to look at causes of autism, there's an 80% concordance rate in twin studies. And what that simply means is, if you have one particular identical twin with autism, there's an 80% chance that the other twin will also experience autism. And so, what does that tell us? It tells us that there's a huge genetic component to autism, but it is not solely genetic, right? If it was completely genetic, then it would be a 100% concordance rate, a 100% concordance rate. And so a strong genetic influence, but it is not the whole complete picture. What we tend to see is that with fMRIs, there are differences in neural connections, and there's a stronger focus on small details as opposed to big picture. Age of parents, as people get older, if they conceive, the prevalence rate of autism increases. And then also prenatal exposure to SSRIs, which are antidepressants. We have found that women who are pregnant who take antidepressants, that can also increase the likelihood of having a child with autism. It is worth noting, because you see it a lot. There is no scientific evidence to support that vaccines cause autism. If you believe that that happens, that is your prerogative. But I, as your teacher, am here to tell you that there is no scientific evidence that supports that idea that vaccines cause autism. And then finally, we are going to talk just real briefly about this other neurodevelopmental disorder, Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome is a tic disorder. And when I say tic, what I mean is that these are compulsions that are very difficult to not do or to hold back. And to be diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, you need to have at least one vocal tic and then multiple physical tics. And so the vocal tic might be a particular word that a person says, or simply sounds, screams, grunts. And then physical tics can be moving of the head or the arms. And these are movements, again, that they can't control. Notice that with Tourette syndrome, It's portrayed a lot in the media as someone who just uncontrollably screams vulgarities. And although that does happen occasionally, it is really just a small, small percentage of those who experience Tourette syndrome. The reality is, most people who experience Tourette syndrome are not screaming out some obscene word. It is simply a word that they say, like coffee, that they have a difficult time to hold back. Tourette syndrome is also associated with strong emotional swings, and the belief is that it is a genetic disorder, specifically impacting parts of the brain like the basal ganglia. And so, if you remember the basal ganglia, that's deep inside your brain that helps you with fine motor control. And it seems like there's weak connections with the neural activity in your basal ganglia, which perhaps explains why we have these impulses or these tics for someone experiencing Tourette syndrome. All right. Hope that helped. By all means, check your book. I will say this. I always tell you, make sure you read your book. Make sure you read your book. For this particular reading, the neurodevelopmental disorder, your book gets really thick into the details. And to an extent, I believe probably goes into more detail than you actually need to know. Starts talking about many columns in your brain and things. Um, Certainly read through this section in your text. Don't get too overwhelmed. This is a small portion of the AP exam. But if you are left with questions, I do encourage you to come see me. And as always, everyone, best of luck.